I told my father yesterday, this room and the heating must have been designed by an engineer.
Thank you.
So it's either too hot or too cold, and we can, and I can say
on average, everybody's got.
on average we're fine, and so we can, yeah, and I suppose we can ask Miriam, and we can open up the windows, and then we'll be okay, right? Then we can have the heating on and have the windows open, and it's perfect. So anyway, I first met Ari about 1.5 years ago in Manchester, England, of all places, where we both participated in the British Association of Jewish Studies conference. We were presenting different things, and then we were speaking about his research with, the long-term single, what we call here in Israel the bitzah, the place where a lot of young Orthodox and then not so young Orthodox tend to live. And I thought it would fit in nicely, and I asked him to submit, and so I think it'll fit in nicely, and it'll also provide a good preamble for Craig's talk about descendant leaving strategies, because here, if we're assuming that religion is a way for descendant leaving strategy, yet we have people who are identifying as religious who are not actually bringing out too many descendants for any number of reasons, I think it makes for an interesting connection.
Thanks.
And Ari started teaching here at Schechter just this semester.
Thank you, Paul. Just some thoughts even just before I begin. I wasn't here yesterday. I couldn't make it. I was teaching in Tel Aviv. But just Eitan in the beginning spoke about how evolution is something that, wanting to be on top of things, Judaism and science has to tackle or deal with or teach or study. I think in my field, I'm a sociologist and a cultural and social anthropologist. In Israel, sociology and anthropology and cultural anthropology kind of merge. As they do in Britain and elsewhere. But I think in my field, evolution to a large extent was something that was very much sidelined and marginalized in the scientific community. I'm talking about social evolution. That is, the idea that was so clear to people in the 19th century that the Australian Aborigines present earlier stage of an evolution, and the British Victorians present the epitome of evolution that eventually the Aborigines will arrive at, given 10,000 years or so. That was known as unilinear evolution. And because of the processes of anti-colonialism, post-colonialism, etc., and of course the Holocaust. While there is some evolutionary research, and there was also in the US in the 50s and whatever, it was still very much on the margins of the discipline as a whole, often criticized. In Israel, I don't know if there is even one sociologist or cultural anthropologist, Zev maybe can correct me, who has an evolutionary perspective. For a brief period, there was Richard Saucis was at the Hebrew University, but he didn't last for very long there, for various reasons. So I myself feel that to a large extent this is an overkill. That is, there's a backlash, a reaction that's leading to missing some important insights that could come out of evolutionary understanding. But of course, one has to be aware, even now, just recently, there have been more journalistic than scientific, but attempts to revive ideas about race being a significant factor in the US, I mean, as using evolution to, just very recently now, a book, I forgot its name already, by a journalist, but who's basing himself on, yes, so with that in mind, I do think it can and should be used. I myself, this research was based on a anthropological, ethnographic research that I conducted. At the time, I did not have evolutionary theory in mind. However, I applied myself to it now and looking for the connections, and I think there is important contributions that evolutionary thinking and theory can add.
I twisted his arm to bring him into the fold.
But do I need this? Like, I don't know if people hear me. Yeah, do they hear me? Because I'm a little, okay. I want to keep my evolutionary, right? The evolution is supposed to be rising and then straight eventually. So I don't want to go bending down. Okay. So first I'll start with my with the research a little. The research is about singles, as Paul correctly said. We'll talk about it more in a bit, but the issue of people who are religious and not marrying at the time considered appropriate by religious society is something that is in Jewish Orthodoxy, and especially in modern Orthodoxy, including in Israel, is a central issue that is causing some social and cultural concern. Now, looking at this on a broad view, obviously, taking a broad view of this, outside of Judaism specifically, I think one sees that one reason for a certain level of angst that there might be about this by religious communities is because religion and family can be shown, and I will show, that they are linked in many religions. Not everywhere, not at all times, but the evidence shows a strong cross-cultural links on this. By the way, Paul, you'll 15 minutes before the end, you'll flash me something? 10 minutes? Okay, good. Okay, so first of all, as far as the findings are concerned, there's the research of Heimdall and Hausknecht, that just really global survey, and you see everywhere strong religion is related to strong family. There are more specific projects, mainly in the US, but numerous, in which it was shown once again that church attendance and participation is positively related to getting married and having children. There's less, I don't know, from Israel of surveys of that sort, but there is definitely scattered evidence that seems to be related, as I'll also show in my own ethnographic qualitative research, that there is a congruence between becoming part of a religious community and having a family, as one on one's own doesn't feel comfortable there. Now, explaining without evolution first on a more maybe even functionalist sociological level, the connection between family and religion, well, it's easy to find how these social institutions are mutually supportive of each other. Family supports religion in various ways. Tradition is usually passed on mainly in the family, especially in Judaism. It's so, we have, on the Passover, there's a requirement to teach your son in the home, but it's also, of course, in other. Christmas. I don't think examples are even necessary. And on the other hand, we see influences in the other direction as well. How religion supports family by, first of all, the commandments, obviously, to respect one's parents, by there's borrowings in both directions. Of course, the ideas of our Father in Heaven, Avinu Malkeinu, and all that, the images. So these two institutions are obviously linked influences going in both directions. Now, one important thing, which is important for the current research on singles, is that in liberal cultures, or simply put, since the 60s, after the sexual revolution, the feminist, whatever, the society that we have today, where most conservative religions position themselves as an alternative to mainstream society, which is seen as liberal. New Age religion is something else again then. But what I'm talking about here is singles in the conservative religions, and that is still the majority of most of what we're seeing. Something on evolution. By the way, this relates also to language. You asked about language before. A few points. First of all, various thinkers and from the past, but also current evolutionary theoreticians consider ritual to have preceded religion. Regarding language, which you mentioned before, Roy Rappaport thought that language that in order for language to develop, as does Deacon actually, in order for language to develop, ritual was necessary. Ritual was the first stage. People were signaling each other, and in order to have faith in language, they had to have repetitive acts. That's his theory. But the main point is that we see here that religion itself, ritual and religion is very early and very basic to human nature and to language. Now, another theory that's related is the unusual tendency of humans compared to apes and compared to apes and primates to pair band. And it is therefore that he considers, he of course doesn't know, but Deacon Rice claims that one of the first rituals, what he thinks might be, of course this is only an unprovable hypothesis, but would have been something that would, not marriage of course, because it didn't exist yet, but some ritual that was signifying this pair bonding, because he sees it as such a central thing to being human and to humanity. So what I kind of find here is, once again, this is of course just hypothesis of Deacon, but well, if it is the case, we see here a very, very, very early link between ritual, religion, and marriage and pair bonding. Once again, emphasizing how singlehood in religion would be something of an oxymoron and a difficulty. We'll see that as more as we go on. Sorry. Yeah. And something from sources who I mentioned before. He writes in an article with Al-Qaeda, religious rituals have emerged to signal female fidelity and commitment. The costliness of these rituals can range from the extreme pain and health hazards of genital mutilation ceremonies to the more benign regular attendance of church, which males in some communities interpret as a signal of fidelity. Once again, stressing the link to religion, to church, to marriage, to family. Yes. And of course, it is easy here to see why the opposite case, that is a case of singlehood, could lead to what Durkheim, who was famed for being the first for establishing sociology as a discipline, but also the first sociological actual research which he conducted, which he gave the term suicide to describe the report on it, was a research in which he compared Catholics and Protestant suicides, finding that in France, yes it is, finding that Protestants commit suicide more often because, and his famous explanation was, because they have more anomie. Anomie was understood by him as having less close-knit communities, less close-knit families, and okay, we're not this is the classic sociological theory maybe, and research, and the connection to here is once again, if we go to, he didn't go to the evolutionary side, he didn't go to the family religion, he didn't discuss that at length, but at least not in that research, but he was more concerned with community. But in any case, Durkheim saw religion as the totem around which all of the community gathered, and solidarity being the main goal of religion in his eyes. So whether we look at it as focused on community, as Durkheim did on family, the modern single in a big city who's something of an atom on his own out there, it would seem that it could lead to anomie, and especially, and that's what I'll be claiming, is that religion and conservative religion structures itself on families and on communities, once again, sidelining and marginalizing singles. Which of course, as I'm saying this begs the question, and why are religious people single? But that's what we're going to see soon, because there are other forces at play here. But it leads to stress and to dissonance because they're being pulled by two forces, which we'll see hopefully soon. Okay, first of all, just on a comparative level, could be a little Israeli. I'll take off my till it gets cool again. So already
50.
really.
You can go a little bit.
Okay. I'll go a little faster then. Just on a comparative level, then I won't go through all the works. There hasn't been many. There isn't much research on singles. There's a lot of research on documenting the connection of family to religion. There isn't much research on those who remained outside of that. What I did find is that there is a lot of parallelism to my own research. There hasn't been much. Some of those works just focused on how singles are marginalized. Let's say the research on the Mormon singles. They didn't focus on how it affects their religious faith and religious practice. There was some of that in the research on Muslim singles in America. It was more kind of preliminary research, wasn't just a PhD, but it was, and there are some parallels. Maybe we'll get to see that later on. And with the evangelicals, also in earlier research, found similar similarities, that their tendency to digress from the commandments regarding sexual constraint, as we see also in my own research on Orthodox Jewish singles. Not surprisingly, I suppose nobody here is shocked by that, I assume. But it's important. Okay, now what I claim is, and I won't go reading all of this to you, is that singlehood should be understood as in the connection of young adulthood. Young adulthood is identified around 20, 30 years ago as a new stage of the life cycle, common in late modernity. That is, there are arguments whether some call it emerging adulthood. I don't go into the small details. From the ages of 20 northward, the main point is that people after college on their own go to live in cities and rent apartments with friends and don't make deep commitments to families and to workplaces. This is the claims of the various research works that were done on this, and this is a new thing, that in the 50s, 30s, 20s, people married in college or whatever. And this is a new stage of life cycle. If in the past it was youth, teenage, adulthood, now we're talking about young adulthood, but this young adulthood is also not completely an age thing. It also has to do with when one goes into marriage. Now, I'll be ahead of myself since I don't know how much I'll have time to describe everything, and just say already up front that I find that conservative religions, and specifically Jewish Orthodoxy, prefer people to skip that stage of the life cycle. They find that stage of the life cycle to be endangering faith and more practice and faith, but also faith. So they would like for them to get married, right, to be under institutions, either family or educational, and then to marry while still in the educational institution, and not to be in a stage in which they finish their studies, are renting apartments, working, traveling the world, going out, enjoying city life, etc. So there's this cultural struggle here between the Western culture and the. Now, just for those of you in the crowd who are not from Israel, so I just want to focus what I'm talking about right here. Israeli Jewish society is generally divided into 4 subsectors, and I'm discussing one of them. The religious Zionists, sometimes called national religious, who are rather close to American modern Orthodoxy. I'm not going to go into the details of the differences. There are differences. Also, I'm not going to go into the details here. I have separate. If somebody's interested, I have written on this separately on this issue, why they actually don't marry, because I'm interested now more in the effects of not marrying upon religiosity. I'll just say that in a very general way, the main reason is that the age of marriage has risen in Western societies among, by the way, upper middle class, not among lower class. And so they are affected by the same forces. And this have to do with changing expectations regarding relationships, marriage not being a must anymore. People, I think everybody feels that how their expectations of marriage are much different than those of their grandparents, and that's especially true for most Israelis whose grandparents came from traditional, not all, but most of them came from non-Western traditional societies, and you see enormous differences already. Yes, there are other factors as well, which I will skip. So what I asked is how they are affected by, how their religiosity is affected by remaining outside the family framework and not being able to find a partner. One thing I will add is that they were all other than one who was gay and in the closet at the time, all the people I interviewed were interested in marrying. They were all not successful in marrying, not successful into their 30s, 40s, but they were all interested and all believed in family values, in religious family values in general. They were not rebels against the family value system. They were just left out of it. Something quickly about the social context. There are two social contexts that I want to relate to here. One is the synagogues. Generally speaking, singles that I interviewed prefer to skip around synagogues, not to be members. The reason is this fits in perfectly with late adulthood. What we know about young adulthood. I got confused with prolonged adolescence, some call it. But whatever it is, young adulthood, this fits perfectly. People not wanting to commit, not wanting to be established. And that's exactly what I found among my whatever. They went to prayer, but they didn't want to be a member of any, and they would usually skip around. Kind of like, other aspects in life, not committing. We'll see. As one of my interviewees told me, I pray in this synagogue and that synagogue. These are all in Hebrew, I translated the interviews. And sometimes in other synagogues, that's it. In a way, I don't really want to be part of a community now. There is something very comfortable in this nomadic state that requires no commitments. If you come, if you don't come, how you come, what you do, what you don't do, I'm living my own life. And by the way, this is one of the things that a different interviewee told me how marriage keeps people religious. He said, in a very simple level, if you don't wake up for davening, for prayer in the morning, your wife will say, well, what's today different from other days? And the people in your regular synagogue will say, hey, where's Harry this morning? So, when you're single, that's not around. On the other hand, the synagogue members themselves, at least the way the singles felt about it, felt that they were kind of like, the synagogue is based upon couples, upon families, and singles don't really have a place in there, even if they would want to. And there were, of the 50 I interviewed, there was one or two who were interested, women, not coincidental I think, who were interested in being part of a community and felt that they were being marginalized or pushed out of the community. As one of my respondents told me, I think that religious community prefers married people. It knows how to handle married people. The roles are clearer. The man comes and gets called up to the Torah. The woman helps prepare the kiddush. That's a special banquet outside. And the roles are clearer. The community doesn't know what role to assign singles. And of course, the religion itself, Orthodoxy, intentionally marginalizes singles because already 200, 300, 400 years ago, there was an earlier actually, in the Middle Ages, there was already pressure to marry at a young age, at a very young age. Katz describes how 13, 14, 15 was the ideal age in the Middle Ages. And so certain religious laws, for example, in European Ashkenazi communities, single men aren't supposed to wear a talit. They're not allowed to lead the prayers on high holidays. In some places, also not other important prayers. Even in the current yeshiva now in Israel, a liberal, very liberal yeshiva, I was surprised to hear that they don't allow singles to do a whole various slew of things in the synagogue, in the yeshiva at the time because they're single. The religious reason being sometimes they say because the single, his mind is preoccupied with women and not pure and whatever. And sometimes it has to do with being an established member or having children to pray for, whatever. Be that what it is, there is such a halacha. Some people are more strict about it, some less, but it exists. The second aspect is the social network of the singles themselves, what Paul called the bitza, which literally means swamp. There's a reason why it's called swamp. I don't have time to get into that now. But the main point, my main point, having done the research, is that while most of Orthodox rabbis and community consider the swamp, the bitza, to have a negative effect on singles' religiosity, as do some singles themselves. Like of one woman I spoke to said, no, I'm not going to move there to the bitza because I don't sleep around, something like that. Which is, she's exaggerating about what's going on there, and she doesn't actually live there, but she's, so there is that image. What I claim is that it has, and yes, that does occur. There's also an opposite effect of preserving religiosity. People would definitely not remain religious without the bitza if they were single. I'll explain how in just 1 second, based using these. You can't read this probably, so I'll just read it for you. This is an example of how there is influence of Western society causing people by this is what the rabbis expect to happen, and it does happen to some extent. People become more attuned, closer to Western cultural values. So here's one woman who was married when she told this to me, but she married at the age of 39, and she was telling about when she was a single. She says, when I was part of a more strictly religious society, I too was more strictly religious. When the society around me became less religious, how did it become less religious? She moved to the Bitzah, to downtown, not downtown, to certain neighborhoods in Jerusalem. And we began going to parties and dancing, stuff like that. It was very easy to step into that place. Slowly, things became less important. You're drawn to what's going on around you because it's fun. It's fun going to a party. You sleep with someone because you love him. You feel that you should express your love. Of course, it doesn't begin with that. It begins with peripheral things. The first touch, the first kiss, that was very meaningful. You continue on because you believe that this is the correct path and you feel comfortable there. I didn't have a guilty conscience about dancing with men. I didn't feel bad about that, maybe because it was something I really loved doing. She's a very good dancer, this woman. I did have a hard time in the beginning with the touching. This was a very dramatic phase. I almost broke down. I remember after kissing the first time 5 years ago, she's talking about age 35, I cried all night. How could this be? How could this have happened to me? It was so difficult. So here's what the rabbis expect to happen. The cultural influence of the bitzah, of the swamp singles living on their own in downtown. They're influenced by secular lifestyle. On the other hand, my claim is, which is not noted by the rabbis, is that it also helps preserve religiosity in a very simple, basic way. As a different respondent said, religion is about family. Shabbat, Saturday night meals, is family. It's about being with someone close. It doesn't have to be family, but someone close. And when you find yourself alone on Shabbat, she doesn't know how she can even do Shabbat. And some of my respondents told me that being alone on Shabbat, so they stopped observing. They turned on television or something else because it was so depressing. Now, by the way, this is another interesting link of family and religion, because it does actually not specify in Jewish law anywhere that one must eat the Sabbath meal, the Shabbat meal with friends. It does not say that anywhere at all. It's just one has to do with how, and in modernity, this was emphasized, I believe, more than it was in pre-modern society. In modernity, with the move to nuclear families, from clans to nuclear families, Orthodox Judaism adapted by moving much of religion into the nuclear family, much more than I believe was so in the past, in the 200, 300 years ago. And so being outside of family has actually become more difficult. So the bitzah, it helps preserve religiosity because the singles eat, I didn't say this is the main point, the singles eat meals with each other. So that's the main point. So they stand in for family, so to speak. Friends, remember the show? The friends are instead of the family. Yes. So I found that they're struggling on two main fronts, the singles. One front that they're struggling on with religiosity, has to do with them being lonely and just saying they don't have enough emotional strength to be religious. And the other one has to do with I wanted to say something else here. All right, this is really kind of one and the same. I'm sorry, I had a mistake. I want to say about the the influence of Western culture being given. Because here, it's kind of one and two are pretty much the same. So that's my main idea. It's the loneliness and enemy on the one hand, and the pull of Western liberal youth culture on the other. So I'll just give quickly an example of each. This is a single man who told me. He says, I figure that if I had a wife and a regular schedule, I would have reached a state of calm and stability in this matter. And then I would be praying 3 times a day. This is something that I am not doing now, and not because I don't want to, I simply don't have the energy to invest in it. Now, it's quite possible that married people with a bunch of kids also don't have the energy to invest in praying a few times a day, but he is 100% convinced, not 99, 100% convinced that it's only because he is single. And it's because he feels weaker emotionally, because he feels that he's out of place, that he should not be living in a situation in which he's at this age and single. There's something terribly wrong with him. That's the general feeling I get of most of these people when it comes to religion. There's something terribly wrong with me if I'm so. Tamar, Tamar maybe brings out this point well. She says, I feel less committed to God. These, by the names, are all not the real names, in case anybody's wondering. I feel less committed to God. He hasn't helped me through these years of singlehood. I still believe in him very much, but I feel like I owe him less. Like he's not above me. This, by the way, this attitude here is typical of postmodern certain attitudes, and also outside Israel, also Israel towards God, which are changing now, but that's a whole different, I could give a separate lecture on that one. He's supposed to be on my side. And if he's not, then I don't owe him anything. It happened to me once that I stayed alone, and it was so horrible to be alone on Shabbat in the apartment that I turned on the television. You understand? And I didn't have any guilt feelings. I told myself, if my social, familial, and communal situation has brought me to this, that I need to spend a whole Shabbat alone, I can watch television and feel okay with it. The thing is that I do believe in God. I always have. Many times I was very alone, and I didn't feel his guiding hand. I felt like it was some kind of Hester. Hester is the Jewish, from the Jewish liturgy, a word for where God kind of hides his face and allows bad things to happen. Sometimes used to describe the Holocaust, lahavdil, the big difference, but that's a term that's used. So it's not that I believe in this. Okay, so that's Tamar. Now, there are the main strategy, and I'll only tell you the main because I don't think we have time for the other two sides. Once the main strategy was of temporal. The main strategy was that all these singles simply said, I am in a period of my life now in which between the Western cultural narrative and the Orthodox whatever, I am not fit for the Orthodox, for what the Orthodox community expects of me, but it's a matter of time. I will return. And in that way, they're very different than, for example, religious homosexuals who see their situation as permanent and have to deal with these things in a it's more difficult for them. So the temporal was very central here, as opposed to the what the research on American Muslim singles said there was a more location thing. They said, at the mosque I'm a good Muslim, outside on the street I'm not. And I find that it's more a temporal thing among these Orthodox singles. They say, at this time, these years, I'm not, it doesn't mean they're not Orthodox at all, but I'm giving myself a break. And so just one example for this. The other two strategies I won't go through are people who don't change at all, but it's a very, very small minority, and say, I am just as religious as I always was, and not making any whatever, or people who end up leaving, changing their religious ideology and becoming less or not religious at all. But those are both minority groups. So the main group, and this is one representative, Yoni, a man who also was married at the time I spoke to him, but he was describing his life prior to marriage. He married at the age of 37. He says, today I'm kind of searching for myself all over again. You leave yeshiva like an etrog, it's like a citron, it's like kept and preserved in a box and very watched over. The citron fruit and for the Sukkot festival. You leave yeshiva like an etrog that was just taken out of the box. You're raised on the older students and rabbis are your role models. It's the value of Shabbat that you draw in and the Jewish home, and the very high halachic standards, that's a Jewish legal standards, high. And following that, after many years of singlehood and very difficult internal struggles against the evil impulse, you begin to compromise. You make all kinds of excuses for yourself, and you allow yourself some slack. Touching is, by the way, I'll stop on that. It's an interesting concept. It became a Jewish legal halachic concept, negia, touching, the being forbidden to touch a member of the opposite sex. Now, this is a completely modern thing. This stricture did not exist prior to the 20th century. It doesn't mean that the rabbis looked fondly among singles fondling each other. No, but the word and the term negia was not used in that manner. Did not exist at all in any of the halachic literature. So this is clearly a response to modern and society, and specifically to the sexual revolution of the 60s and to changing standards and to Jews being emancipated and going out. So this is clearly, you see the cultural wars here, and how the singles, and that's my opinion, are caught in between. The singles, because they don't fit into they don't have the Orthodox solution, they're caught in between this cultural war. Anyhow, so he says touching, and he's clear to him that his audience, me, understands what he's talking about, touching females. Touching and missing prayers and all kinds of things and parties. And after that, when you marry, you say, hey, wait a minute. Now, by the way, parties. Why are parties forbidden in his mind? Because, what?
Lead to mixed dancing.
Yes, it's not lead. They are based on mixed dancing. Okay? I just want to make clear, because once again, people who don't have the Jewish Orthodox background here, what is this clear to other people is not. And after that, when you marry, you say, hey, wait a minute, how can I renew what I had in yeshiva? I can't go back to yeshiva, and on the other hand, I'm no longer single. In the beginning, I asked him, did you intentionally change your behavior as a single? He said, the answer is no. In the beginning, I saw my behavior as bediavad, that's ex post facto, meaning what you behave in a way when there's no choice, not the ideal possibility. I never turned it into an ideology. But I was definitely lenient with myself. I viewed myself as being in the state of anus, that is compelled to sin. There are different statuses in halacha: patur, exempt, shogeg, sinning unintentionally. I feel that I am anus. What can be expected of me? So this is a very interesting situation because the rabbis, the Jewish rabbinical literature always emphasizes that one must get over his evil compulsion, the Yetzer Hara. That using the term anus could no way work in the eyes of the rabbis when it comes to fighting your Yetzer Hara, your evil compulsion. So he's bending the traditional discourse. Now, so I'll just end. Like I said, there are others differently, but I'll skip the other options, and I'll end with trying to figure out what if it all this means for us. So on a more theoretical level of family, religion, and evolution. Yes, so like I said, the connection, the link between family, community, and religion is not only a Jewish thing. One thing that's interesting. Wait a second. All right. One point that's interesting to note here, by the way, is that the various researchers, there aren't many, there are only like 4 or 5 research on religious singles that I found at all throughout the world, which I think is under-researched field. They're all dealing with religions that don't have monasticism as an option. I'm wondering if in Catholicism and Buddhism, in which being an adult man and single and celibate is considered positive, if there's a more positive image of people who are without family, at least as a possibility, even though the single is not, of course, in that status. But it's a thing to think about. Just turns out that they're all, the Mormons, Muslims, Jews are all and the evangelicals are all non-monastic religions. So that's just a point to think about. Regarding the religious Zionism itself, well, just the basic stuff that I said, that the challenge of being pulled by Western and by the counter, the religious orthodoxy, Jewish orthodoxy attempts to put up something against Western liberal culture, and the single, I believe, gets caught in between because of his status. He's less grounded in Orthodox society, so he's pulled in both directions. Yes, and sorry, I'm just skipping around because I'm trying to sit with that time here. Yes, so the main question I want to focus on here is cultural heritage destiny as biology destiny. That is, if as evolutionary theory claims, if religion is indeed inherently linked to family, but is that something that must be? That is that something that must be in the future as well? Can religion be more friendly to people who are outside the family, or is religion inherently programmed to be based upon family? Of course, there are different religions. Hare Krishna obviously is not family, but still, if we're talking about conservative majority religions, but there, by the way, in those other religions that are not family, there's often a very strong sect or cult even group, so there is strong solidarity. So the question is, and I'm opening this as a question because I don't know, can it really be otherwise in strong religions? Okay, not in when religion is just an extra pepper to life, let's say. And I think with that I will end.
I'd like you to go back to the one where you put the evolutionary explanations and really that one, and talk about the findings in those 3 contexts.
Those 3 contexts? What 3 contexts?
The evolutionary theorists to be adaptive behavior, and we emphasize the role of religion as ensuring female fidelity. Particularly those 2. And how you could understand your findings in those 2.
Okay, let's try. Yes, well, this, by the way, the idea of religion being necessary for solidarity, as I said, is already Durkheim's. He was, I think, the first proponent of it. But what's interesting is that recent evolutionary theorists, current evolutionary theorists, also suggest that. Now, I think for the singles that I researched, I think it is about solidarity to a large extent. That is, they do identify with the religious Zionism, with God, with Judaism, with Israeliness as it's in the religious Zionist Israeli, whatever. There's also room for Israeli identity, and they are all central to them as individuals. But I think maybe what's difficult is that, if in this, so to speak, primeval, totem and bonfire with a tribe around, so all the tribe members are of the same status, more or less. And by the way, as Victor Turner pointed out, one of the things that helps people have solidarity is the idea that they're all on the same status. When one is rich and one is poor, solidarity is more difficult or almost non-existent. Here it's the same thing. What's difficult for them is that when they go to the synagogue, if it's not some unusual synagogue, they'll see everybody with families and kids, and everybody, they think at least, is looking at them and, okay, why are you alone at your age? And so it's hard for them to feel that kind of unity with the group. Now, this might still be good for the group. Look, Durkheim was the first to say that deviance has he was thinking, Durkheim, not on people's well-being, he was thinking on society. Deviance has a point. Deviance gets to kick people, show people what you should be doing by the deviance getting punished. So he would say, yes, it's good. Single people should feel marginalized. That way you get most people not remaining single. If single people stop feeling marginalized, more people will be single. And by the way, I'm sure some rabbis would agree. Costly religious rituals and female fidelity. I suppose it goes just to show us how central that is, right? The female fidelity and the now. I don't know. How do you connect it to singles now?
It seems like the bitzah supports the first, but does away with the second.
The bitzah supports the first. It is. You're saying the bitzah stands in for the synagogue as a first. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. But it only works to a certain extent. The bitzah, it also only to a certain age. But yeah, you're right. It works. The bitzah can stand in for that. It doesn't. The bitzah doesn't obviously encourage. No, but this whole. I mean, they're outdated, of course. I think we should be said, right? Female fidelity. I mean, we're talking about an evolutionary process, but one would hope that now the terms are a little different. But what happens in a bitzah is part of the same thing that happens in all similar communities of non-Jews in New York or Amsterdam or London, in which this young adulthood, part of young adulthood, I didn't mention consumer society, I skipped over that part, but part of young adulthood is influenced by consumer society attitude, and consumer society is about having choices, being able to buy things, being able to exchange things, being able to try things, and that's kind of what this young adulthood is copying on the level of relationships. This, by the way, is Zygmunt Bauman, the philosopher, that's one of his claims, that young people today, he calls it liquid love, and he's of course critical of it. And he says, of course, because he's older and people of that age tend to be critical of what people in their 20s are doing, but he said it's about trying out even sex with different people, with different sexes for some people, trying out different kinds of things, going trips to India, trips to South America, as so many Israelis go on these trips, and that's part of also seeing how I am in different surroundings and so that's what the bitzah is about, and it's not about. It's hard to see where it connects to any evolutionary past over there. Yeah. I take the questions? Okay.
To what extent are we dealing with shifting reproductive strategies? So that, maybe in a time when material resources weren't as available, you went in for a lot of children and hopefully some would survive. But now that we have such great public health, material resources, we're dealing with a shift in reproductive strategy. And so this is the old school religion is representing a reproductive strategy that's not mapping onto what we see happening today.
Right, but you're, by the way, assuming, and I'm not saying it's not true, but you're assuming that people today are still driven by evolutional, needs. Like, how do you explain people who don't want children at all, a growing movement? How does that fit in?
Yeah, well, we could bring in some meme theory now, but I'll stay away from that. You're suggesting that single is childless, is that right?
In this society, okay, that's actually a good point you're bringing up here. So in this society, that was the default, but then what's happened now over the last 10, 15 years is that many single women who are religious as well have started having children on their own, usually, at least officially and usually, by artificial insemination. As a friend of mine told me, a single woman who was living on a yishuv, that is on a settlement in the West Bank where everybody's very religious, he said as soon as they understood that I didn't enjoy the process, they were okay with it. That is, that didn't include sex, that's just artificial insemination. So that's one of the things that is happening now, that they're having more of these women with their 1 or 2 children, usually not more, and that's threatening religious communities because it's setting a new model. Because they go into synagogues, they go to prayer, and it's like, first of all, it's complicated. Let's say she has boys, so where do they sit? There's separate seating for women and men. So who do they sit with on the men's side? Or they sit, and then once they grow up, so it's like a different model. And it challenges what one of my earlier interviewees said about how the synagogue has roles for the wife, for the husband. So. It's still a small phenomena, but it's there are more and more, I think now, many religious single women as they hit 40, that seems to be a cardinal age there, often do have families. But I'm going back to your question. I think we would need proof. I mean, you probably know more about evolutionary theory than I do, that people are still acting based on evolutionary impulses. I mean, just because evolution got us the kickstart, does that mean that now individuals, even, by the way, Durkheim, I think he thought about evolution as a group process, solidarity as a group, not as an individual impulse. I mean, yes, so I think... Yeah.
I always wonder about the reproductive strategies and ask the question, which group is having more sex, right? The Orthodox religious people or the non-religious people? Whether they're having more kids is a different question. I think non-religious people tend to have more sex.
How is that related to evolution?
Well, that's the evolutionary drive to reproduction, to the reproductive act. We've cut off the...
They're having sex with more partners. I don't think they're necessarily having more sex. I think it was been found that married couples have more sex than singles, generally. Better sex or not is a different question. Yeah. Yeah.
First of all, it seems to me that, evolutionary speaking, to go backwards, evolution doesn't need family, doesn't need families at all, and
it doesn't? It does not? But this is not what they said. They said that in order to raise children, you need a social contract between a man and woman that will be committed to the children. That was one of his claims, that they're different from apes in that.
But it seems to me, speaking from an evolutionary perspective, you don't actually need that. It's society that needs family, not evolution. And it's more so, man needs families, not women. I mean, from a biological perspective, not sociological, because you can reproduce and have children. A woman, as a woman, I'm speaking, you can reproduce and have children, and that's it. But the man interest is to have contact with his children.
Why is that? Why is that an evolutionary interest?
No, because the monkey doesn't care what his
Well, that goes to
The monkey doesn't care, but it seems that men did care. I mean,
but then it's not evolutionary exactly. The male bear does not stay with you, right? She raises them on her own, and he doesn't mind. You have the next generation of males.
The man stays, the male stays and raise kids.
So that was one of his points. That's the main change he claimed that. Deacon was that was the change of humans compared to primates, and that's where he focused religion as having a role, which is why I don't know. I'm not an evolutionary expert, so I'm just saying I know that there are many mammals that don't. Yeah.
It points towards your second point, though. That I agree with you. What we're dealing with is paternity certainty.
Yeah, right.
And the conundrum for the male animal over evolutionary time was to invest resources in non-genetically related children. That's cuckoldry, and that was the dead end. So, I see your second point in spades there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah.
And I would like to say that, I think it was 2 years ago, there was a scandal that there was a meeting of single religious, I don't know if women alone or, I don't remember, but one of the speakers was a rabbi's wife, and she blamed the single women for not marrying because they're not preserving themselves for.
Yeah, it's a common blame, common accusation.
And it became a big scandal because people came to the stage and answered her back, and it was.
Okay.
And they said, "You don't understand us. You don't understand the problem at all."
Okay, so this
The differences between men and women in religiosity, the single man and the single woman.
Is there a difference?
Yeah.
Yes, there is a difference. Women are, in the non-Israeli religious Zionist singles, yes, the women are more pressured to marry at a much younger age. They consider themselves old singles, especially some of them who were raised in traditional religious Zionists at the age of 23 may consider herself an older single. Then she'll laugh at it when she's 30 and say, oh, how I thought that back then. But it exists. They don't get to enjoy singlehood as much because they're pressured already at the age of 25, 26, 27. And the men while they do want to marry, there's also a certain... as one of my respondents described to me, and I think she's correct about it, sometimes after being in a very strict yeshiva for a bunch of years, and then finding themselves in a land of singles, they kind of have, they do want the good times. Some of them, a little more. So there's the difference that way.
But I mean, in terms of their religiosity.
In terms of the religiosity, I didn't think there's a difference that's that clear-cut. I found a different difference, which isn't, I think, only related to singles. It has to do with a whole different subject. That is that the women preferred a more personal God image, and the men had a more abstract God image. That has to do, I think, with, at least in my generation, or later, the yeshiva education was more Maimonides, Lithuanian yeshiva, which is more abstract God. Nowadays, there are more and more people in Israel also are going for the more Hasidic personal God. But at least in my research, there was a difference that way. Women were more apt to, like the one I told you, argue with God. You weren't there for me. And men, none of the men would ever think in that way. God is an abstract concept. We have to, not somebody you wheel and deal with. But now that's common more among everybody as society's changing. Yeah.
How does divorce factor into this? Since
How does
divorce?
Yes.
Divorce, because that's something that is allowed within Judaism, which is not
Yes.
the case, let's say.
I think. Well, divorce is a parallel thing. As the numbers of singles have been going up, and I didn't mention that, the numbers have been going up of religious singles. The number of divorcees have also been going up, and what's happening with them is to some extent parallel. Some of them also find themselves, depends what the situation is with the children. Some of them find themselves also in the back in the singles community. Some less. They tend to be even more sexually lax because they've already been accustomed to having sex on a regular basis. So if they were virgin till marrying, now they're out there again, and their usually attitudes are very different. Often they're not. At least sometimes they're not in a big rush to get married again. So there's more sex going around with them. Speaking of sex, because some are want to get married, but they tend to be lax. You can even find these straight somebody who's very deeply religious, but she'll still have sex after her first few dates. So it's a parallel thing, and I think it's also one of these things. All these things you have. I kind of feel like there's the family values of religious Zionism. They're like a holdout, trying to hold out strongly against these social processes of that. What gives them power is that they're not setting out in order to destroy the religious family. It's like happening as a by process, say, as opposed to people who, ideologically believe this shouldn't happen, or sometimes with gay, religious homosexuals, no, men should, everybody should be able to marry who they want. Here there are people who all say, yes, we believe in a religious family as a principally good thing, but they themselves don't find their partner or they divorce, and this is causing all kinds of issues.
Did you say that you researched the Muslim community too?
No. I said that I was quoting Elamin Naim. She is a woman who did, a Muslim woman in America who did a doctorate on Muslim singles.
Okay, just because I'm interested to know if the Muslim community, women, singles, also want to have children alone.
No, I know. No, I think that there is no such thing. That doesn't exist. By the way, I wouldn't say the Muslim community because there's a million Muslim communities, but even in the more liberal Muslim communities in America, where, for example, some Muslim women pray in the mosque than is common. Elsewhere, I don't know about such a